Hello, everyone. I'm Melanie Weaver Barnett, Chief Executive Education Officer at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. I want to start by thanking you all for joining us for this first session of our online seminar series, Organizational and Leadership Resilience in Challenging Times. So welcome, everyone. And today's topic focuses us in on high-stakes leadership, decision-making in times of crisis. At Michigan Ross, something that comes through in everything we do is our belief in the power of business to do great things in the world. And we know that the primary drivers of what organizations do in the world is the leaders of those organizations. So our goal with this series is to equip you with actionable ideas for making yourself and your organization resilient throughout the crisis and position powerfully for the turnaround and for success in the future. I need to take a moment to cover a few housekeeping points. So everyone is in listening mode for this session. You have the ability to ask questions along the way via the chat, and we encourage your questions. Submit them as they come to you throughout the online seminar. And Professor Barger will answer as many of those as possible, and following the online seminar, we will send answers to most, if not all, of the other questions. The messaging system here is set up to be direct to the moderator as opposed to messages among participants, so just know that. We are recording this and we'll send a link afterwards so you can share it with others and refer to it if there's anything you want to refer back to. And if you have any difficulties, technology difficulties, please submit those in the chat too, as we have technical people right here with us to provide support. So we have over 1,400 people signed up for this online seminar. Many of you are already friends and alumni or executive education client partners. For those of you who are new to us, welcome to the Ross family. I'm going to take 2 minutes to say a few words about Michigan Ross and then introduce and turn you over to someone I am both lucky and proud to work with, Professor Mike Barger. So as you can see from these statistics, and that we are a top business school, ranked very highly by most rankings institutions, and we're really proud of that. But what we really want you to know is that what we're all about is powerful ideas to create purpose-driven leaders who make significant positive impact in the world. That's the most important thing to know about Michigan Ross and what you experience when you interact with us. Our executive education organization, which is what I'm in charge of, offers programs around the world. Wherever you are, we will come to you and deliver programs for you. We do both open enrollment programs that you can sign up for and come to campus for, or our locations in Asia and other parts of the world. And we also do custom programs where we develop a program specifically for you to meet your needs. So we hope you'll contact us later if you're interested. And I'm going to now introduce to you our Professor Mike Barger. Professor Barger, as you might expect, leads courses in leadership during times of complex organizational change and times when critical decisions need to be made. Importantly for all of you, he has a great deal of practical experience as well as academic experience in this specialty as well. He has that experience as a fighter pilot in the Navy, as an instructor, and as chief instructor of the Navy Fighter Weapons School, which is the Top Gun school. In addition to that, Mike was the founding member of JetBlue Airways, and he created JetBlue University. While serving as the head of JetBlue University, Mike helped create a doctoral program in workplace learning leadership at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also received his doctorate in education. Following his time at JetBlue, Professor Barger served as Chief Operating Officer at CorpU, an education technology company. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and we are going to learn more about managing and leading in a crisis environment.
Hi, Melanie. Thanks so much, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. These are certainly very interesting times, and it's wonderful to be able to spend a little bit of time with all of you, many of whom I have known over the years from classes or other businesses that I've been with. But it's great to be here with you today to talk about this topic, high-stakes leadership, decision-making in times of crisis. As Melanie described in the introduction, I do have some interesting experience to build on, and you will hear as I go through my 30 minutes or so of content today, some references to my experiences both in the military and as a founder and executive at JetBlue. As we move along today, it would be great if you would think of questions or things that you would like me to expand on at the end. I hope that we have some time for some Q&A, which I believe that we will at the end. Okay, so as I get into this conversation, I always like to start conversations about the challenging business environment that we're all operating with by introducing this term that we refer to as VUCA. It's an acronym that stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it's a term that was introduced by Army leaders, a decade and a half or so ago, as they were describing the increasing complexity and volatility and uncertainty of the combat environment, the military environment. And in my experience, having spent now 20 plus years in the business environment after spending time in the military, it's pretty clear to me that the business environment is taking on these exact same characteristics. It really is incredible, the environment that we're all asked to operate within these days. And so I think the recommendations that I'm going to share with you today can be pretty useful for you as a leader that's operating in this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment of ours. So what we know about the VUCA world, and as you can see on the slides here, is that things sometimes can go sideways in an instant. And I will reference through today's presentation various challenges that might identify certain organizations, and I'm certainly not trying to pick on any of these organizations. Heck, I ran an airline for 13 years, and I have hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of places where things didn't go so well for us as an organization. But whether things go sideways in an instant, which they can do sometimes, or whether they go sideways over a longer period of time, what we know about leadership in the VUCA environment is that these are the times that the importance of leadership become very clear. These are the times that we require, that we need, that our organizations and our stakeholders need us to be willing and able to step up and lead when the stakes are high, when leadership is needed most, and in most cases without a playbook to lead from. And this is going to create a particularly interesting challenge for leaders. Now, today, that's thinking about this global challenge that we're all finding ourselves in, I want you to think about this COVID crisis that we're working through as I work my way through my material today. And I want you to think about your experience with COVID-19 and this virus and this challenge of ours in a number of different ways. I'd like you to think about it as a business leader, and many of the folks I know that have joined us today are thinking about this as a business leader. How is it that this particular scenario is challenging you as a business leader? That's one lens that I'd like you to look through. But I'd also like you to think about this as just a person, as a citizen of whatever country you happen to be a citizen of. I know we have folks from all over the world that have joined us today. How is this impacting you as just a human being, as a citizen stakeholder in your area? How is this impacting you as a parent or as a spouse or a family member or the parent of a student or of children who are conducting business someplace around the world? And you'll see as we go through today's conversation that these different perspectives are a really important part of how we think about leading in a VUCA kind of environment. Now, when I teach this class to MBAs at the Ross School of Business, I like to start my presentation by using a kind of a visually sensational image like you see here. And I'm not trying to pick on any particular company here. And in fact, I'll share with you an image of a situation that took place at JetBlue quite a while ago, but obviously very visually sensational as well. But I like to start my presentations by just asking the question, as you look at an image like this, is this the kind of thing that seems like it would be a crisis? I know we haven't defined it, and we're not going to get too bogged down in definitions of crisis today, but I think it's pretty safe to say, looking at this image, that we certainly had a crisis situation going on here. I then like to ask, crisis for who? And by that, what I'm trying to get to is that in this particular case, and if you recognize this image here, this is an image of Deepwater Horizon. This was also the subject of a Mark Wahlberg movie some years back, so it got lots of airplay around the world. But this was a platform that was managed by BP, and so certainly this was a crisis for the team at BP. Interestingly, BP wasn't the organization that was actually running the platform. That was an organization called Transocean. And neither BP nor Transocean actually manufactured the platform. The platform is manufactured by the heavy engineering arm of Hyundai Industries. Why do I share all of that? To underscore the idea that sometimes when we are looking at a crisis situation, it's difficult for us to identify different stakeholders who might have a value proposition, who might have a stake or be impacted some way by a crisis. And that's going to require us to be very thoughtful when we are leading a team through a crisis, to think through the various stakeholders that might be impacted by this challenge of ours. On the screen now you see the definition that I like to use in class that defines what a crisis situation is. Again, we're not going to get bogged down in definitions today. I just want to underscore that the notion of crisis tells us a couple of things about the situation we're in. One is that a change of some sort, a decisive change, is impending, and two, that there is a very distinct possibility that the outcome of this situation will be highly undesirable. What I tell students in class is that I don't spend a lot of time defining the bright line between what qualifies as a crisis and what is just a really bad situation. If it requires the leadership team to get together, and whether that's the executive team of an enterprise or just the leadership team of a unit or a small group, that's close enough to me if it takes that amount of focus. What we know about leadership in these crisis situations is that, first of all, people who are impacted by a crisis situation will look to leaders for tangible evidence of leadership. They will be looking to see who is going to guide us through this situation. When they look, they want and need leaders to believe in. And they also, what we know from the research, is they don't expect leaders to be perfect or omniscient. They don't expect you to have a magic wand to be able to solve things immediately. But they do expect us as high-stakes leaders to be visible, to be courageous, to be out in front, and to be committed to the best possible path forward. Now, the reason that I have people highlighted in red here is I like to think about this notion of people as the various stakeholders that might be impacted by a crisis situation, and those stakeholders will, in almost every case, have different or vastly different perspectives on the situation. The bottom line here is that ultimately perspectives matter. These different stakeholder viewpoints matter, and so as we, in our MBA class, unpack what's going on with a situation like Deepwater Horizon here, the picture you see in the background, I like to ask, so is this a crisis for the executive team of BP or Transocean or Hyundai? And the answer is, of course it is. Well, what's the perspective or the viewpoint of the employees of those three companies? or the families of the employees of those companies, or customers, or community members, or investors, or channel partners, or regulators and advocates, or the media. All of these stakeholder groups can view this exact same scenario, this situation, from entirely different perspectives. And when we're leading through a crisis, each of these stakeholder groups will require unique care and support. Now, I do find it interesting to look back over management education over these last 50 years or so, and for the first 40 of those 50 years, the common belief was that if you're actually doing a good job managing, then you're not going to let crisis events happen. And in fact, this quote that you may have been looking at the lower right-hand corner of my slides so far comes from Professor Jerry Myers. Jerry taught a crisis leadership course at the University of Michigan Ross School for about 35 years before he shared his materials with me and I took over the course. And Jerry, for his entire time teaching the course, didn't buy into conventional wisdom about the idea that, hey, if we're good managers, crisis won't happen. He believed that it's much better to think about how we're going to manage them when they do happen, not spend all of our time trying to prevent them. And what we see just from business practices today, just from the VUCA environment that we operate businesses in, from the way that we go about getting products out into the market, getting software out into the market, it turns out that today we are driven more to be ahead of our competitors and get things out into the market before they're necessarily 100% ready to go or 100% complete. And so we actually, just by the nature of business today, are finding ourselves creating our own little crisis scenarios because we are expecting our customers to tell us what's not working well, what features they like and what features they don't like. And so we actually have kind of from a business operations perspective embraced this idea of having to deal with these mini crises as they come along. I don't know how many of you have read this book, The Excellence Dividend by Tom Peters. Tom is a colleague of mine, leadership guru, spent a lot of time at McKinsey, but has done a lot of research on just leadership in general. This is one of his most recent books. One of the best business books I've read in quite some time, so highly recommended. It's a pretty easy read. He has a very interesting style. But one of the topics that Tom addresses in his book is this idea of how do we compete exceptionally well in today's marketplace. And what he shares in this book are these two acronyms. The first one stands for whoever tries the most stuff wins, and the second, whoever screws the most stuff up wins. And what he's really doing is he's underscoring this idea that we need to get things out into the marketplace. Not that we need to put people at risk or to create safety situations, but we can't wait for the perfect solution. We have to get out in front of things. And again, that just kind of underscores or emphasizes this idea that we are going to have to deal with these kinds of crises. Now, they may not be as sensational as a flaming oil platform like we see here. In fact, lots of crises are almost imperceptible to anyone but the individual or the team that are working through them. But the question is no longer if we're going to find ourselves in a crisis, it's more of a when. The academic arc that I use in my crisis leadership, my high-stakes leadership course at Ross, follows essentially this path. We talk about stakeholders and how important they are to the process of not just running a great business, but navigating a crisis situation. We then talk a little bit about resilience, and how important resilience is to our ability to stay in business long term. Then we move to stakeholder reactions, crisis varieties, the nature of crisis leadership, and some ways that we can prepare for crisis. And I'd like to follow this same framework over the next 20 minutes or so until we get to some Q&A. I'd like to start back with this topic we've already introduced, this notion of stakeholders. So as you think about this from a business perspective, and I appreciate that those of us that are not business people, maybe we're just family people, as a parent or a sibling, you are obviously connected to your familial stakeholders. this conversation is a little more around business stakeholders, but it's really important in any context to understand who these stakeholders are. If we want to build relationships with them, if we want to create value out of those relationships, we need to know who they are. And what you see on the screen here is a graphic that describes, in fairly generic terms, the typical types of stakeholders that a business would have. The question, once you've identified who your stakeholders are, is what are the value propositions that your enterprise and these stakeholders have together? The asterisk here is just to remind me to say that these understanding the value propositions of your stakeholders is not just applicable to the crisis environment, but it's just really good business, as you would expect. Understanding what your stakeholders expect of you, where they find value in their relationship with you, and for our context today, how would a crisis, or this crisis that we happen to be in if you're navigating one, how does that crisis threaten this value proposition? That's a fundamental concept that may be the most important headline from my chat today, is how well do you understand the value propositions of your stakeholders? And in a crisis scenario, how is that value proposition threatened? In a crisis, knowing the value proposition and knowing that the value proposition might be threatened, how should each of these groups be engaged? Assuming that the crisis environment is not going to give us the time or resources that we need to engage every single one of these stakeholders as frequently or as rigorously as we would like to, we're going to have to make some decisions around which are the priority stakeholders that we need to be engaging with. Through which type of messaging? What are we going to tell these stakeholders that are priorities in a crisis? What modes and media will we use? How frequently will we connect with them? And if we move on from this stakeholder group to that stakeholder group, how do we sequence those things? The moral of this stakeholder description here is, how do we demonstrate to these stakeholders that we're actually owning this crisis that we're trying to navigate? How do we preserve, to the extent that we can, or rebuild the trust with these stakeholders that they had placed in us prior to the crisis that is now threatened as we navigate through the crisis? And we want to be thinking, as we're engaging these stakeholders during a crisis, that we want to become the source of the facts. One key lesson that we hear from organizations navigating crises all the time is that, well, we try to stay connected with our stakeholders. We try to communicate with them effectively, but lots of times we don't have a lot of new news to share, and so we don't communicate. And a real important lesson here when we are navigating a crisis situation is that every one of our stakeholders is looking for information as fast as we can get it to them. And so a nice takeaway lesson here is that no news is actually news. And so don't think because you don't have something new to share that it's not worth the time to communicate with folks. Another aspect of this communication, thinking about stakeholders, comes from some research that was done back in the Ebola crisis, which is now maybe a little bit close to home given where we are with COVID. And a colleague of mine, Jay Walker, wrote a paper, and sorry, there's a lot of words on this slide, and maybe some of you are watching this on a fairly small screen, so I'll share the bolded words here with you. What Jay wrote back at the beginning of 2016, when the next major pandemic strikes, it will be accompanied by something never before seen in human history, an explosion of billions of texts, tweets, emails, blogs, photos, and videos rocking across the planet's computers and mobile devices, down to the lower bolded text. As a result, hundreds of millions of people will receive unvetted and incorrect assertions, uncensored images, unqualified guidance, all of which, if acted on, could endanger their own health, seriously damage their economies, and undermine the stability of their societies. And interesting how prophetic Jay was when he wrote this. But not to go down that rabbit hole, but more from a perspective of just managing the communications during a crisis. The reality is, as we think about our communication responsibilities, is that folks, stakeholders, will be looking for information. And they are going to fill in the holes in that communication stream through whatever mechanisms are available to them. So my suggestion to you when we're dealing with a crisis situation is be the owner of the accurate facts and data. The most up-to-date, current, accurate information is going to be coming from you, which means if you don't have any news to share, don't have your stakeholders thinking about whether or not there's news to share. Okay, own that. No news is news. And interestingly, through our COVID-19 challenge, we see all kinds of interesting things coming from conspiracy theorists and other folks that are coming up with all kinds of interesting things, like the fact that the coronavirus actually came from coronavirus, which is kind of interesting. So there is just a summary. That was probably the longest part of what I had to share today, just this idea of really understanding your stakeholders, what value propositions they have with your organization, and how those value propositions are threatened when you're facing a crisis situation. Thinking about this idea of resilience here, the second part of our formula, is that resilience, as we understand it, is typically this idea that, well, resilient things are able to bounce back from difficult times. And there was some really great research done by a number of researchers who've studied resilience. This graphic comes to us from Stephanie Duchek, who did some pretty nice work here. And really the core lesson that she and her team had to share from her research is that resilience isn't just a matter of being able to bounce back from a challenging situation. Yes, that is part of being resilient, but thinking back on the value of our stakeholders, we can actually increase our resilience, okay, by leveraging relationship with stakeholders, not just while we're picking ourselves back up, but while a crisis is ongoing, so during that coping phase, and even before we even find ourselves in a crisis situation. That stakeholder network of ours can be one of our greatest assets in helping us identify potential threats to our organization so that we can address them before they become full-blown crises. So as we think about resilience here, and I appreciate that given the COVID crisis, many of you are hoping to get some takeaways today that allow you to deal with this crisis right now. Help me, Mike, deal with this thing that we're grappling with now. I know many others of you, or maybe the first group of folks, is also looking for ways to think about how do I deal with the next one? How do I prevent with the next one? And prevent the next one. And this topic of leveraging your stakeholders to be more resilient by allowing them to help you identify potential threats to the organization, this is really valuable for you long term. So engage your network to help you identify potential threats. Involve your network as you deal with a crisis that's ongoing, and of course involve these stakeholders as you're recovering from crisis. And then demonstrate your commitment to these stakeholders continuously, and you will find that they actually have as much value to add to you as an organization as you have to add to them. So we got a sense of stakeholders and the importance of resilience. What value might we find in thinking about how stakeholders actually react to crises? Well, this is a great way for us to start to think through how would we plan to deal with these stakeholders when we find ourselves in a crisis situation. And once again, and I do have a few models to share today, here we can see a pretty simple model that helps us as business leaders predict how our stakeholders are likely to respond so that we can start to develop response plans before we find ourselves in the middle of a crisis. So in this particular model you see on the screen here, on the left side of this graphic, we're using the crisis that we happen to be in as the trigger event. That's what these authors describe this as. So think of that as kind of a violation of their expectations. So they had expectations of the company that they have a value proposition with. This crisis has threatened that value proposition. So what do they do now? Well, that's what this model is trying to describe. they view this trigger event as something that now deserves some amount of evaluation. And so they think about two things primarily, according to a good bit of the research. First, what responsibility did the leadership or the company have in the creation of this crisis, and how bad was the damage, or how significantly did this impact me? Okay? They take their evaluations, and that generates some amount of what these particular authors call moral outrage. So it sounds like kind of a harsh term, but I think it makes intuitive sense that based on the level of responsibility that they assign to the company, the degree to which they were impacted or hurt by this crisis, that feels like it would change the amount of kind of emotional outpouring that they would have given the scenario. And that emotion, that moral outrage, is going to lead to some amount of some impact on the reputation of kind of the business in the eyes of those stakeholders, and it will influence somehow their future intentions. So the point of all of this is that if we have a model that helps us predict how our stakeholders are likely to respond given a particular crisis scenario, it might generate some ideas for us to use to build preemptively, right? So proactively before a crisis, build some at least generic responses that we might have ready to go when we find ourselves in a crisis. So appreciate your stakeholder reactions to particular types of crises, frame your communications to address those reactions, and wherever you find yourself as a business leader responsible for a particular crisis situation, what the research tells us is you are in almost every case better off owning that up front, even though you will get some pressure from certain units within your organization. Owning it tends to be the best policy. Now, given this model, how can we proactively frame engagement and communication? That question takes us into this kind of fourth area I want to talk about here, and that's crisis varieties and responsibilities. So what I suggest as you think about how would you start planning for potential types of crisis is that you actually start by crafting what we call a typology. Now, what's a typology? Well, different crisis types are going to impact a unique subset of your stakeholders in a unique way. Okay? And a list of these different types, what I describe as a typology, will facilitate the creation of response plans. Okay? And each crisis, while it's going to be a snowflake, it's going to be its own thing. No two crises are alike. They do tend to fall into a handful of categories. So we have experts, researchers, that have taken a look at collectively exhaustive and mutually exclusive kinds of lists of crises, such as this list of 9 that came from Jerry Myers, the creator of the crisis leadership course at Ross 40 years ago. And he talked about these 9 categories of crisis, each of which might benefit from you and your leadership team spending some time discussing and planning for what happens if we find ourselves in one of these. PwC does an annual or semi-annual CEO research where they talk with CEOs all around the world, and part of their report after their research and analysis generally includes some sort of, here are the crisis categories that CEOs around the world are concerned about. And you can see the 7 on this list from PwC's most recent report. Gary McCusker is just an expert in public relations, and as he looks through the lens of public relations disasters, here is a list of different types of crises that he suggests for the companies that he works with. You should have a PR response plan for these 7 types of crises. And finally, a colleague, Condoleezza Rice, a name you're probably familiar with, and Amy Ziegert out at Stanford, they wrote a book not too long ago called Political Risk they used for their political crisis leadership course out at Stanford. They've organized these 10 different categories of political risk crisis. So what's the point of all of that? You will have access to this recording and these slides so you can take a look at these things later on. The idea, though, is that different types of crises will impact a unique subset of stakeholders in a unique way, and having this list may be one of the best steps you can take to start to work through ways to come up with crisis response plans. Similarly, we see researchers that don't so much like the categorical list approach, but they tend to like the idea of let's compare a couple of different characteristics of crises. Like in this case, maybe there's a couple categories of predictability versus a couple categories of influenceability. How might we have dealt with this situation? And out of this kind of comparative analysis, you can come up with examples and ways to resolve certain combinations of crisis situations. Another example is, maybe we look at where the crisis came from. Was it internal or external to the company? Was it controllable, not at all, or fully controllable, and come up with some examples there that we might use to build a plan to how would we deal with these kinds of things. Another similar example, again, inside, outside, maybe it's intent. Maybe there was an accidental component versus an intentional component. Again, the idea here of these two-dimensional typologies is that in lieu of a list, maybe this combination of characteristics helps you as a leadership team differentiate between different crisis types and help you prepare a response for these different situations. That's the idea here, trying to proactively define ways to respond to crises before you are facing them. And then finally, there are hybrids of those kinds of things. Here's an example of three different types of victim, accidental, intentional, and then a list that goes along with them. Again, the point here is that responding to crises on the fly without any sort of planning is probably going to be very challenging for you, may not produce these results that you want. Thinking through likely areas of exposure and how the firm should respond can be immensely helpful. And my recommendation is that you do spend a little bit of time as a leadership team thinking through these different types of crises. Okay, let me see if I can get this to work here. So as we think about the nature of the crisis environment, unlike any other type of situation for a group or a business, these crises present many ominous and anxiety-producing unknowns in situations where a clear picture of the facts is cloudy or even totally obscured for long periods of time. The unknowns in a crisis, in this exploration of the nature of the crisis environment, is what you see, or the unknowns are what you see here. A threat of some sort to one or more of the stakeholders' value propositions, a situation that calls for, in the eyes of at least some of the stakeholders, urgent, if not immediate attention, and an uncertainty about the origin, the nature, or the potential consequences of whatever the threat is. And once again, just by considering the nature of the crisis environment, we can see how important it is to communicate with our stakeholders about what we know and what we expect and what we're doing to deal with the situation. We know from our research that crises rarely are the outcome of a single event or a root cause. They're almost always the result of multiple contributing factors which interact over time to produce threats, potentially devastating threats, to a particular group or organization. Why is this important? Because it tells us that in most cases, there are many warning signs before, often well before, there's a full-scale crisis. And back to my earlier comments about resilience, when we can leverage our stakeholders as early warning systems, it is remarkable how many potential crises that we can deal with before they actually become critical. Now, consistent with the description I shared earlier about just the VUCA world that we operate in and live within, all organizations, all that I have worked with for sure, are facing growing levels of complexity. And as complexity increases, these early warning signals and subtle and maybe even not so subtle vulnerabilities become much more difficult to spot. And take our COVID-19 situation as an example here. Even as we watched the development of the situation in Wuhan, China, The complexities of our tightly coupled world made it really difficult, even for healthcare experts, to predict the potential of this, what we're now seeing as a historic pandemic. Regardless of your political perspective, we appear to have grossly underestimated an appropriate response. Not because we didn't see it coming. After all, we all watched it. But because we couldn't navigate the complexities of various systems, political, social, economic, health and welfare, to name a few, that govern our lives. Okay? The book, The Politics of Crisis Management, a really good read, and I do recommend this book for any of you that are really interested in just the crisis environment in general. The authors here nicely summarize the unique challenges facing today's high-stakes leader, and I'll read you a quote here from their book. They say, "The very nature of the crisis environment creates a seemingly impossible task setting for high-stakes leaders. It requires urgent decisions while essential information about causes and consequences remains unavailable. It requires effective communications to a variety of audiences with widely differing needs and views and frames of reference. And it requires that leaders explain vulnerabilities in existing institutional structures, values, and routines, as well as vulnerabilities in the leaders themselves." Okay? Being a high-stakes leader will require you to face these realities, to embrace vulnerability, both of the systems that we operate within and of ourselves, and to lead without a playbook, because that's what the crisis environment demands of us. Okay. The last two pieces here before we get to some Q&A, just crisis leadership and then crisis preparation. In the crisis leadership area, I'm going to borrow a little bit from my friends in the U.S. Army in their Be, Know, Do framework, which I do think is really useful here. As we think about the way we need to be during a crisis situation, what we know from the research is that we need to be visible. We need to be caring. We need to understand that folks have different perspectives on the crisis, and we need to be empathetic to those different perspectives. We need to be calm. Our folks need to feel like that we've got at least some degree of control over the situation, and we need to be assertive. We're not going to have all the facts and data. We can't just sit back and wait for the perfect description of the scenario. We need to step in and actually demonstrate some leadership. From a know perspective, we need to know what our vision is for the unit, for the team, for the organization. We need to be comfortable with what our values are. What do we stand for? How do we address the situation consistent with who we are as a group, as a person, as a team? And we really do need some guiding principles that will help us navigate the decision-making process. What's most important to our team? What is our most important commitments to our stakeholders? What are those general guiding principles? And if you don't have those at your organization, you should really have those, because not just because it's a great thing to run an effective business, but if they're really useful in times of crisis. And then from a doing perspective, as you've heard all through my presentation today, we need to communicate. We need to make decisions, even if it's not comfortable, even if we don't have all the information or the data, even if it feels like if we just waited a little bit longer, we would be in a position where we can make better decisions. We need to be decision makers. We need to get out in front of these things. And we need to take responsibility where appropriate. And again, being a high-stakes leader, high-stakes leaders will require you as a high-stakes leader to face these realities, to embrace those vulnerabilities, and to lead without a playbook. 3 examples just really quickly I'd like to share with you. I'm not going to read these. They will be in the deck here. And I do suggest that you do a little internet scan, because these things are available. 3 really nice examples of summarizing these Be, Know, Do principles that I just shared with you. General Stanley McChrystal, who was I got to know General McChrystal as he was a board member at JetBlue, just published the other day in the New York Times a nice piece here on what 9/11 taught us about leadership. And in this piece, he talks about how leaders must be visible with their plans and honest with their words and adaptable with their actions. That we can't, as crisis leaders, simply wait things out. We can't give in to the instinct to just kind of hunker down and sit back and wait for a perfect situation. We need to get out in front of these things. And he offers here, and in the interest of time, I won't spend any more time on Stan's message here, but offers 4 kind of principles that he suggests you think about to get out in front of your teams during a crisis situation. The second example that I find really useful comes from my old colleagues at JetBlue, the current CEO and president here, Robin Hayes and Joanna Garrity, posted this message to all 23,000 JetBlue crew members. That's what JetBlue calls their employees. And this message is all about where we are. It's being transparent. It's being upfront. It's acknowledging the unknown. And it's talking about and sharing, these are the plans that we have to execute to survive, to take care of you, to continue to live up to the vision and values of the organization. And maybe some of you even saw Jeff Bezos's message that went out to his Amazonians here recently, where Jeff walks his team through the current situation, what's different, what's been changed, what are some unique challenges they're facing, how is Jeff himself thinking about taking the company forward in support of this challenge. All 3 of these are really good reading, and they underscore this notion of how a leader should be, what a leader should know, and how a leader should behave, what they should be doing. Okay, and finally, before we do some Q&A, I would share with you just a few thoughts here on crisis preparation, and it's really just a summary of what I've talked about so far. Being prepared for a crisis means having a sense of the types of crises that our organization is most likely to have to grapple with. It means having a sense of who are those key stakeholders and how are those stakeholders impacted by different types of crises. And when we do find ourselves in a crisis, what are the steps that we are going to take? Acknowledging that these different crises are all snowflakes, they're all going to be slightly different. How can we prepare in the most effective way possible to be able to grapple with these things? And so I'll leave you with here before our Q&A, this idea of proactively developing a crisis response strategy. So have your list of potential crises. Think about whether or not either to supplement your list or replace your list, some combination of different crisis characteristics that might help inform a response in different type scenarios. Have an idea of who your stakeholders are, and then work your way through at least a tabletop 30,000 foot view of this would be our plan. This is what people with different roles and responsibilities would do. These are the tools that they'd use. This is how we're going to engage stakeholders. This is how we're going to communicate with them, maybe even have a communication plan ready to go in these certain types of crises. So a challenge for you in your organization, at a minimum, is identify a particular likely crisis type that you might have to work through. Say it's a product failure. Say it's dealing with COVID-19. Identify the key stakeholders that are most likely to be impacted by the scenario. Work your way through, if you have such a two-variant matrix or some such thing, work your way through the different combinations of situations that you might find yourself in, so that at least at a minimum, you can identify where there are some holes that you just really haven't thought about before, and you can begin to put together some sort of high-level crisis response. And then perhaps as a result of COVID-19, all organizations will recognize how important it is to prepare for these kinds of things, because they do happen. It's not a if, but a when, and that preparation will make companies much more resilient. So as I close here, I will say simply that business will continue to be incredibly unpredictable. We can't over-prepare for a crisis. Effective high-stake leaders understand how to address the unique needs and concerns of all of its stakeholders. They're willing and able to step up and lead when leadership is needed most, and particularly in times when there's no playbook. And then finally, coming back to what these stakeholders are really looking for from their leaders in a high-stakes situation. They want people who are demonstrating tangible evidence of leadership. They want and need leaders that they can trust and believe in, and they don't expect you to be perfect or have a magic wand, but they do expect you to be visible, to be courageous, to be even vulnerable a bit, and to be committed to the best path forward. So Melanie, with that, I will flip my camera around here and turn it back to you if we had some questions that came up during the presentation.
Yes, we did. We have a lot of questions and we have less time than we anticipated to answer them. So I'm going to offer two things before we get to some of the questions. The first one is a lot of the questions were about communication during a crisis. So I'm just going to remind everyone here that our webinar, our online seminar next week will be with our Dean, Scott Giroux, and it is specifically on leadership communication during a crisis. So tune in for that to get lots of answers to those questions, although we will also send out responses to the common questions from this online seminar by email. So look for those also. And you know what, Mike, I'm thinking we might call on you to set up an office hours for questions. Some of our faculty have set up online office hours. I think people would love to have the opportunity to do some direct Q&A with you after this, so stay tuned for that, everybody, as well.
I'd love to do that.
Awesome. So now let me just ask a couple of the questions that are coming in. Let's see. During the current COVID crisis, should companies focus on getting right the existing business only, or are there opportunities to get into adjacent areas? So, you know, do you focus on the crisis at hand? How much time do you spend on that? And how much time and effort do you spend on expanding your perspective and your opportunities?
Yeah, good question. We certainly heard from many companies that they have shifted their focus a little bit to some, slightly or largely different business. I think the best answer for that is if there is a short-term opportunity to kind of help in a broader sense, consistent with your vision and values as an organization, then it may make sense for you to support kind of the broader community effort here in dealing with this crisis. But secondly, I probably ask you or suggest that you kind of identify really the long-term kind of vision goals of the organization. What are your core competencies? In all likelihood, the core competencies that you've built were directed toward kind of your previous direction, maybe not this new direction. And so if you're going to think about doing a little mini or heavy pivot, I would look long and hard at kind of all of the assets that you've already kind of created and accumulated, and ask yourself the question, where are those assets best directed, right? At the previous direction or in this new direction? And if there's a way to do both of those, then that would be really cool.
All right, Mike, here's another question. Should a leader prioritize the stakeholders for effective decision making? You talked a lot about the importance of understanding your stakeholders. So the question is, should you prioritize those? And if so, how would you do that?
Yeah, great question. So what you're going to find, and when we deal with that very question in the MBA class, we actually use different examples of different crises. And what we take away from those examples is that different flavors or types of crisis are probably going to impact certain stakeholder groups significantly and others not so much. So I think the best way to deal with that question is to do some sort of an exercise using a typology of some sort and play it out. So if we have a cash shortage type of crisis or a public relations type of crisis or a product failure crisis, in our business, in our scenario, which stakeholder groups would be impacted the most, and then prioritize those in your engagement and messaging. And that, I think, underlying that question is this idea that we're going to have limited time and resources. We would love to, and at some point we're going to have to engage all of our stakeholders, but we're just not going to have enough time initially. So what are the priority stakeholders that we need to engage? And because every crisis is a snowflake, it may be hard to figure that out real time. So having some general categories that you've already thought through will be really helpful.
Right. I want to honor our time commitment, and we're at 11:59. So again, everyone, look in your email. We will send out responses to the common questions that we have. It looks like we're going to be able to set up some office hours with Mike that you can chime in for and ask questions of him live and directly. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and we hope to see you next week for our webinar with our Dean Scott Giroux on communications in a crisis environment. Thanks, everybody, and go Blue.